The sun hung low over New Orleans, Louisiana, casting a golden glow over the historic courthouse steps. It was a symbol of justice, power, and, for many, a place where justice had long been denied. Welcome to Shadow Crime. Before we begin, please like the video and subscribe to the channel so we can continue creating even better content. Thank you so much. All right, let's get started. Inside, Judge Charlotte Blake sat in her chambers, scanning through legal documents for one of the most significant cases of her career. A case that could change everything. A case that would challenge how the Louisiana police force handled racial profiling, unlawful arrests, and systemic discrimination. She had spent decades fighting for justice, breaking barriers as a black woman in a field dominated by white men, and now she had a decision to make, one that could reshape the system forever. Ethan Carter, arrested for existing. Just 2 weeks earlier, Ethan Carter, a 22-year-old black man, had been walking home in his own neighborhood when he saw the flashing blue lights behind him. No crime had been committed. No laws had been broken. But that didn't matter. Officer Ryan Matthews, a young, ambitious white cop, had spotted Ethan and decided that he looked out of place. "You fit the description of a suspect in the area. Hands where I can see them." Ethan had barely had time to react before he was slammed against the hood of a police car, his face pressing against the hot metal. "You're making a mistake," Ethan protested. "I live here." "Yeah?" Ryan sneered. "Then why do you look so nervous?" As if being scared of armed officers wasn't a natural reaction. As if history hadn't taught black men to fear situations like this. The situation escalated until another police officer arrived, a veteran on the force, a black officer who had seen this story play out too many times. "That's enough, Matthews." Officer Michael Hayes stepped in, his voice calm but firm, a man who believed in the badge but also believed in change. He recognized what was happening. Ryan wasn't stopping Ethan because he was stopping him because he was black. Hayes ordered Ethan to be released, but the damage had been done. A young man had been humiliated, detained, and almost charged for existing. And now, the case was in the hands of the court, and Judge Charlotte Blake wasn't going to let it be ignored. A clash of justice and prejudice. The case had gained national attention. Activists, journalists, and legal experts all knew that how this was handled would set a precedent for the entire country. Would the system continue to allow racial profiling, or would the court finally hold police accountable? Charlotte Blake had made a name for herself as a fearless and impartial judge. She wasn't here to make friends. She wasn't here to play politics. She was here to make sure the law served everyone equally. But as she prepared to enter the courthouse for the hearing, something happened that reminded her why this fight was far from over. Profiled in front of her own courthouse. As Charlotte walked up the steps, focused on her case, a police car pulled up beside her. A familiar voice called out, "Ma'am, stop right there!" She turned. It was Ryan Matthews, the same officer who had arrested Ethan Carter, the same officer now on trial, and he was stopping her. The most powerful black judge in Louisiana. "We had a report of a suspicious person in the area. You match the description." Charlotte blinked, her anger bubbling beneath the surface. "Excuse me, I'm going to need to see some identification." The irony of it was almost laughable. A black man arrested without cause, and now a black judge about to rule on that case, being treated the same way. But before Charlotte could respond, another police car pulled up. "Ryan, stand down." It was Officer Michael Hayes. Again, of a reason. Again, cleaning up Ryan Matthews' mistakes. "That's Judge Charlotte Blake," Hayes said, his tone sharp. "You just tried to detain one of the most powerful judges in the state for no reason." Ryan's face went pale. He had just made a career-ending mistake, and Charlotte Blake would make sure he answered for it. The fight ahead. Inside the courthouse, a storm was brewing. The prosecution, led by Samantha Green, was preparing to expose Ryan Matthews and the larger issue of racial profiling. The defense was scrambling, trying to justify what could not be justified. And the jury? They held the power to send a message to the entire nation. Would this be another case swept under the rug? Or would this be the moment that changed everything? Judge Charlotte Blake took a deep breath as she entered the courtroom. Court is now in session. The battle for justice had begun. The morning air was thick with anticipation. Today was a defining moment, a case that could reshape how Louisiana handled racial profiling. Judge Charlotte Blake had spent the past several weeks preparing for this trial. A young black man, Ethan Carter, had been arrested without cause. A police officer, Ryan Matthews, had detained him based purely on race. And now, the entire justice system was watching to see how this would play out. Charlotte had presided over countless high-profile cases in her career. She had seen racism hidden behind legal jargon. She had watched police officers justify actions that had no justification. And she had ruled on cases where the system worked harder to protect itself than to serve justice. But this case, this one felt personal. She pulled up to the courthouse, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. As she made her way toward the entrance, she was focused, determined, ready. And then a voice cut through the air. The interrogation at the courthouse step. Charlotte turned, her sharp gaze falling on a uniformed officer standing in her path. Ryan Matthews, the very office center of today's trial. You need to show identification immediately. Charlotte eyebrow, her patience already wearing thin. Excuse me? Ryan took a step closer, his stance firm, authoritative, unyielding. We've had reports of a suspicious person in the area. I'm going to need to see some ID. Suspicious person at a courthouse. The courthouse where she had presided as a judge for years. Charlotte inhaled deeply, reining in the fire threatening to rise in her chest. Officer, I am Judge Charlotte Blake. I have a case to oversee in 5 minutes. I don't have time for this nonsense. She pulled out her official judicial ID, holding it up so there could be no mistake. Ryan barely glanced at it. He didn't step aside. Instead, his expression hardened. You match the description of a suspect we're looking for. I'm going to have to ask you to wait while I confirm your identity. Charlotte's stomach twisted, not in fear, but in bitter, seething anger. She knew exactly what was happening. Her ID didn't matter. Her title didn't matter. Her authority didn't matter. Because she was a black woman, standing alone, and to Officer Ryan Matthews, that made her a suspect first. Before Charlotte could respond, another voice cut through the tension. Matthews, stand down. A second officer approached, his tone firm and unmistakably commanding. Sergeant Michael Hayes, a veteran officer, a black man who had spent his career trying to change the system from the inside. Do you even know who you're talking to? Hayes demanded. That is Judge Charlotte Blake. Ryan froze, confusion flickering across his face before turning to panic. He looked back at Charlotte's ID, suddenly seeing it for the first time. Judge Blake? Yes, Hayes snapped. The judge overseeing today's racial profiling case, and you just proved exactly why we need it. Ryan hesitated. He shifted awkwardly, unwilling to back down. I was just doing my job. He muttered, his face flushed. She matched the description. Charlotte's lip pressed into a thin line. No, Officer Matthews, what I matched was your bias. And you just handed me more evidence for today's case than I could have ever asked for. Ryan's face drained of color. He had just exposed himself. His prejudice, his assumptions, his refusal to acknowledge authority when it didn't come in the form he expected. Michael Hayes exhaled sharply, his disappointment evident. Judge, I apologize for this. Don't apologize for him. Charlotte's voice was controlled but icy. Make sure it doesn't happen again. To me or to anyone else. With that, she walked past them, her posture strong, unshaken, unwavering. But inside, there was a bitter irony. She had spent weeks preparing for this case, gathering evidence to prove that racial profiling was a real damaging force. And in less than 2 minutes, it had just happened to her. Right on the steps of the courthouse. The weight of history pressed down on her shoulders, the undeniable proof that the fight was far from over. Court is now in session, and this time justice would not be ignored. The courtroom was silent, the air heavy with tension. Everyone present knew this was more than just a case. This was a fight over something much bigger. This was about how the justice system treated young black men. This was about whether the law truly served everyone or just those in power. At the center of it all sat Ethan Carter, a 22-year-old black man accused of nothing but treated like a criminal. His hands rested in his lap, clenched into fist as he prepared to speak. Across the room, Judge Charlotte Blake sat high on the bench, her face unreadable. She had just experienced the very same injustice this trial was about. Now it was time to expose it for what it was. Prosecution, Yoon Carter testifies. Samantha Green, the sharp and relentless prosecutor, stood and approached the witness stand. Mr. Carter, can you tell the court what happened the night you were arrested? Ethan swallowed hard before speaking. I was waiting for my ride home after work, standing outside my apartment complex, like I always do. And then the police car pulled up. He paused, took a deep breath. Officer Matthews got out and asked what I was doing there. I told him I lived there, that I was just waiting for my ride. But that wasn't enough. Samantha nodded. What happened next? Ethan's jaw tightened. He told me I was acting suspiciously. He asked for my ID. I gave it to him. But he kept questioning me, like he was waiting for me to slip up, like he had already decided I was guilty of something. The courtroom was silent. All eyes were on Ethan, and then he told me to turn around and put my hands behind my back. For what? He didn't say. He just handcuffed me. A murmur rippled through the crowd, and there I was, standing outside my home, in cuffs, in front of my neighbors. I hadn't done anything wrong, but in their eyes, I was already guilty. The cross-examination confronting Ryan Matthews. Samantha turned to the defense table. The prosecution calls Officer Ryan Matthews to the stand. Ryan stood stiff as a board. His once confident demeanor from the night of Ethan's arrest had disappeared. He knew the questions were coming, but he wasn't ready for them. Samantha wasted no time. Officer Matthews, tell us why you stopped Ethan Carter. Did you see him commit a crime? Ryan shifted in his seat. No, but did you receive a report about criminal activity in the area that matched his description? Not exactly. Did you see him holding a weapon? No. So why did you stop him? Hesitated. His eyes darted toward the defense lawyer, but there was no lifeline coming. He just looked suspicious. A heavy silence filled the room. Samantha's eyes narrowed. Suspicious how? Was he acting aggressively? Was he threatening anyone? Was he breaking the law? Swallowed hard. No. But then what made him suspicious? Was it the fact that he was standing there? Or was it the fact that he was black? The weight of the truth. Ryan's face turned red. His hands fidgeted in his lap. I didn't mean... You didn't mean what, Officer Matthews? You didn't mean to expose your own bias? You didn't mean to admit that Ethan Carter was arrested for no reason other than the color of his skin? The courtroom erupted in whispers. Ryan looked down at his hands, realizing what had just happened. He had walked into a courtroom thinking he could justify what he had done. But he had just done the opposite. He had proven the prosecution's case for them. Judge Charlotte Blake leaned forward, her voice steady. That will be enough for today. The case wasn't over yet, but the foundation had been shaken, and everyone in that room knew it. Ryan Matthews had just exposed himself. And justice was coming for him. Hey, the tension in the courtroom was thick enough to cut with a knife. Judge Charlotte Blake sat tall on the bench, her hands gripping the wooden gavel tightly. She had spent decades upholding the law. She had seen injustice in many forms. But today, it wasn't just another case. It was personal. Across the room, sitting stiffly on the witness stand, was Officer Ryan Matthews, the same officer who had detained Ethan Carter without cause, and the same officer who had tried to stop Charlotte on the courthouse steps just hours ago. Her gaze locked onto his, studying him carefully. Did he realize who she was now? Did he understand what he had done? If Ryan did, he didn't show it. Instead, he sat rigid, hands clasped, his jaw tight, as if he were still trying to convince himself that he had done nothing wrong. But Charlotte wasn't convinced, and neither was the prosecution. The prosecution strikes back. Samantha Green, the fierce and relentless prosecutor, rose from her seat and stepped forward, her high heels clicking against the marble floor. She had waited for this moment. "Officer Matthews," she said, her voice sharp but controlled, "let's go over your reasoning again. You stopped Ethan Carter because you found him suspicious." Ryan nodded stiffly. "Yes. And what exactly did he do that was suspicious?" "He was standing alone, waiting. He seemed uneasy." Crossed her arms. "Seemed uneasy?" "Officer Matthews, did Ethan Carter say or do anything illegal? Did he resist you? Did he make any threats? Did he even so much as raise his voice at you?" Ryan shifted uncomfortably, his face paling. "No, but..." "No?" Samantha cut him off, her tone razor sharp. "So what exactly was the reason you put him in handcuffs?" The courtroom was dead silent. Ryan hesitated. "I was just being cautious," he muttered. "Cautious," Samantha repeated, her voice laced with sarcasm. "Cautious of what exactly? The fact that he was standing outside his own home? Or the fact that he was a young black man in a hoodie?" Ryan's lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't answer. Because there was no answer that could save him. Charlotte steps in. Judge Charlotte Blake exhaled slowly, reining in the simmering anger in her chest. She had to remain impartial. She had to stay professional. But that didn't mean she wouldn't demand the truth. "Officer Matthews," she said, her voice steady but firm, "may I remind you that you are under oath? I need you to answer clearly. Did you have any reasonable suspicion, based on fact, not feeling, that Ethan Carter had committed a crime?" Ryan: "No, Your Honor." "Then tell me, Officer Matthews," Charlotte pressed, "why did you stop me this morning?" Ryan's face went pale. The realization hit him like a truck. The woman he had tried to detain outside the courthouse. The one he had dismissed without even checking her ID. She was now staring him down from the judge's bench. I didn't realize," Charlotte's voice didn't waver. "Did I do anything suspicious?" Ryan opened his mouth, then shut it, because he knew the answer was no. "Did I match the description of a suspect?" "No, Your Honor," Ryan murmured. "Then tell me, Officer Matthews." Charlotte leaned forward slightly, her piercing gaze locking onto his. "Was it just because I was black?" The crumbling facade. Ryan looked down at his hands, visibly shaken. For years, he had believed he was just doing his job, that he was following protocol, that his actions were justified. But now, he was realizing that the very system he thought he was protecting was built to work against people like Ethan Carter, people like Judge Charlotte Blake. Samantha didn't let up. "Officer Matthews, it seems to me that your definition of suspicious is actually just black and existing in the wrong place at the wrong time." Ryan said nothing because there was nothing left to say. The courtroom reacts. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. For the first time, Ryan Matthews realized what it felt like to be on the other side of power. He wasn't the officer in control anymore. He was the one being judged. And Judge Charlotte Blake had already made up her mind. "This case is no longer just about Ethan Carter," she said, her voice cutting through the room. "It is about the way we police our communities. It is about the unchecked power that allows officers to act on bias rather than fact, and it is about making sure that changes today." The verdict approaches. Ryan Matthews had no defense left. Ethan Carter had been arrested for nothing, and now the entire courtroom knew it. Now the only question left was, would the system finally hold one of its own accountable? And Judge Charlotte Blake was about to decide. The courtroom was silent. Tension hung thick in the air, pressing down on everyone present. This was it. The moment that would decide whether justice was real or just a dream for people like Ethan Carter. The moment that would determine whether an officer would finally be held accountable for racial profiling. Judge Charlotte Blake sat tall at the bench, her face unreadable. But inside, she felt the weight of history pressing against her shoulders. She looked toward the jury box. 12 people, 12 lives, 12 voices. Would they choose justice or would they choose the system? The jury foreman stood, clearing his throat. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor." Charlotte nodded, steadying herself. "Please read the verdict." The decision that changed everything. The jury foreman unfolded a piece of paper, his voice clear and unwavering. "In the case of the state versus Officer Ryan Matthews, we find the defendant guilty of unlawful detention and misconduct." A collective gasp rippled through the room. This was it. A guilty verdict against a police officer, something that rarely ever happened. Ethan Carter exhaled sharply, his body trembling. For so long, he had been waiting for someone, anyone, to say that what happened to him was wrong. And now the entire court had. He had been humiliated, degraded, and treated like a criminal for doing nothing at all. And today the world saw him for what he really was, an innocent man. And the man who put him in cuffs, now, he was the one being held accountable. Nash Ryan Matthews. Ryan Matthews faces his reality. Ryan Matthews' face turned pale. For years, he had believed that his badge made him untouchable, that stopping a black man for looking suspicious was just standard procedure, that no one would ever question his authority. But now he sat frozen in his chair, his hands clenched into fists. His career was over. His reputation was destroyed. And for the first time, he understood what it felt like to be powerless. He turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Judge Charlotte Blake. And in that moment, he recognized her, the woman he had stopped on the courthouse steps, the woman whose ID he had ignored, the woman he had treated as suspicious without cause. And now, she was the one deciding his fate. A bitter, undeniable irony. A lesson too late. Ryan swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Your Honor," he started, his voice weak. Charlotte met his gaze, her expression unwavering. He wanted to say something, anything. An apology, an excuse, a plea for mercy. But what could he say that would undo what he had done? Officer Matthews," Charlotte interrupted, her voice firm. "Do you now understand why you're here?" Ryan hesitated. For years, he had told himself that he was just doing his job, that suspicious behavior was enough to justify his actions, that his instincts were always right. But now, he could see the truth. He had ruined an innocent man's life. He had abused his authority, and he had done it without ever stopping to question why, clenched his jaw. "I was wrong," he admitted finally, his voice barely a whisper. "I see that now. But it's too late, isn't it?" "Yes, it is." Justice, but at what cost? As Ryan Matthews was led out of the courtroom, Ethan Carter sat still, staring ahead. He had won, but why did it still feel like a loss? Because no matter what happened to Ryan Matthews, nothing would erase what Ethan had been through. The stares, the fear, the handcuffs tightening around his wrists. The knowledge that, to some people, his innocence would never be enough. Judge Charlotte Blake watched him carefully, seeing the pain that still lingered in his eyes. "Mr. Carter," she said gently, "you were wronged. No verdict can undo that. But today the system listened, and that matters." Ethan nodded slowly, but he wasn't sure he believed it. Because tomorrow, somewhere else, another young black man would be stopped for looking suspicious. And would the system listen then? Or would it turn away like it always had? A new beginning. As the courtroom emptied, Charlotte remained seated at the bench, deep in thought. Justice had been served today, but justice wasn't a single moment. It was a fight, a continuous battle. And as long as she wore the robe, as long as she had the power to make a difference, she would keep fighting. For Ethan. For those who had been silenced, for those who still needed justice. The courthouse hallways were nearly empty. The trial was over. The verdict had been delivered. Justice had been served. And yet, Ryan Matthews stood frozen, waiting near the judge's private exit, his fingers twitching at his sides. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the one in control. He had spent years believing he was a good cop, that he was protecting his community, that his instincts were always right. But today, the system he thought would protect him had turned against him. And Judge Charlotte Blake, the woman he had dismissed as just another suspect that morning, had been the one to bring him down. Now, he needed to face her. But what could he even say? A confrontation he couldn't avoid. Charlotte emerged from her chambers, still wearing her judge's robe, her expression unreadable. She saw him immediately. She didn't flinch. She didn't slow her steps. She walked right past him, heading toward the exit. Ryan panicked. "Your Honor, wait." Charlotte paused, turning to face him with an arched brow. "Officer Matthews." Her voice was calm, but it held the weight of everything that had just happened in court. Ryan swallowed hard, suddenly feeling like a rookie again. I just wanted to say, I didn't know. I didn't realize what I was doing." Charlotte's eyes narrowed. "You didn't realize?" Her tone wasn't angry, but it cut through him like a blade. "You mean to tell me that after years on the force, after hundreds of stops and arrests, after standing in a courtroom and hearing your own words used against you, you still didn't know?" Ryan looked down at his hands, flexing them like he was trying to shake something off. "I thought I was following protocol. I thought I was doing my job." Charlotte let out a slow breath, shaking her head. "No, Officer Matthews. You weren't following protocol, you were following bias. You weren't doing your job, you were abusing your power. And the worst part, you didn't even question it until you were the one under scrutiny." Ryan flinched. Because it was true. He hadn't questioned it, not when he cuffed Ethan Carter. See, not when he stopped Judge Blake outside the courthouse. Not until he was the one sitting in the witness stand, feeling small, feeling powerless, feeling like he had lost control. Now, he was looking at Charlotte, hoping for what? Forgiveness? Understanding? "I want to do better," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know how." Michael Hayes steps in. A deep voice broke the silence. "Then you need to make a choice." Both Ryan and Charlotte turned. Standing in the hallway, arms crossed over his broad chest, was Sergeant Michael Hayes. The veteran cop, the man who had pulled Ryan off Ethan Carter that night. The man who had spent years trying to change the system from within. Hayes walked toward them, his steps slow and deliberate. Cops like you, Ryan, they always come to a crossroads after something like this. You can let this be the moment where you finally wake up, where you start to unlearn everything you thought was normal. Or you can keep pretending that this was just one mistake, just bad luck, and go right back to the way you were. Ryan felt his throat tighten because he knew exactly what Hayes meant. He had seen other officers get caught doing the wrong thing, and most of them, they didn't change. They got defensive. They blamed woke culture. They said, "It's not my fault." and they went right back into the system, convinced they were the real victims. Ryan didn't want to be that guy, but was it too late for him? Ryan looked up at Charlotte. "Do you think I can change?" She studied him for a long moment before responding. "That's not my decision to make. It's yours. But understand this, apologies mean nothing without action. Saying I didn't know doesn't undo the harm you caused, and it sure as hell won't change the system that made you this way." Ryan felt a lump in his throat. She was right, turned to leave, but before she did, she gave one last look to Hayes. If he wants to change, show him how, but that's on him to prove. Michael Hayes nodded, turning back to Ryan. "Well, what's it going to be?" Ryan inhaled deeply. He could walk away, pretend none of this happened, stay inside the comfort of the system he had always known, or he could face the hard truth, admit his failures, and start doing the work. The choice that would define him as Judge Charlotte Blake disappeared down the hallway. Ryan stood at a crossroads. One path led back to who he was. The other? He didn't know yet, but for the first time, he was willing to find out. The case of Ethan Carter, Judge Charlotte Blake, and Officer Ryan Matthews is not just a courtroom drama. It is a reflection of a much deeper issue embedded in society. It highlights the systemic nature of racial bias, the struggles of those who experience discrimination, and the difficult path toward change. Here are the key lessons from their journey. 1. Racism isn't always obvious, but its impact is huge. Many people assume racism only exists in extreme forms, slurs, violence, or outright discrimination. But the truth is, racism can be subtle, systemic, and deeply ingrained. Ethan Carter wasn't beaten. He wasn't charged with a crime, but he was still treated as guilty or proven innocent, humiliated, handcuffed, and stripped of his dignity for no reason other than how he looked. Racial profiling is one of the most common, yet most destructive forms of discrimination. It doesn't require hate, just unchecked bias. And its victims, they carry the scars long after the moment has passed. 2. Even those in the system can be blind to their own bias. Ryan Matthews never saw himself as racist. He believed he was doing his job following instincts that had been reinforced by years in law enforcement. But when forced to confront his actions, he realized he had been complicit in a broken system. The biggest problem with discrimination is that those who enforce it often don't even see it. Change doesn't come from denial. It comes from awareness. It is only when people like Ryan Matthews recognize their own bias that real progress can begin. Even the powerful are not immune to prejudice. Judge Charlotte Blake is a highly respected, powerful Black woman, yet even she was stopped and treated as a suspect. If racial bias can affect someone with her status, what does that say for those without power? Her experience proves how deep the issue runs. It is not just about individual racism. It is about a system that reinforces these biases at every level. No amount of success, education, or prestige can fully shield someone from discrimination, and that is why the fight for equality is far from over. 4. Justice is more than a verdict. It's a commitment to change. Ethan Carter won his case. Ryan Matthews was held accountable. But did that truly fix the system? Justice is not about one case, one verdict, or one punishment. Justice is about long-term change, changing minds, changing laws, and changing how people see the world. Real justice happens when people like Ryan learn from their mistakes, when people like Judge Blake continue to challenge the system, and when people like Ethan Carter don't have to prove their innocence just for existing. Final thought. This story is a reminder that the fight for justice is ongoing. Racism doesn't disappear with one trial. It disappears when people stop looking away. It disappears when people question their own biases. It disappears when we demand more than a guilty verdict. We demand a better system, because justice isn't just about what happens in a courtroom. It's about what happens next.